Hello, everybody. Welcome to room one. We've got our 2:15 session here with John Turner, who's going to be talking about microservices microservices will save your life and other lives. Really excited to have John here. As a reminder, during the session, you are more than welcome to put in questions into the Slido chat on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be reviewing those at the end of John's talk, and we'll answer them live for you here. Without further ado, I think we can go ahead and get started. John, the time is yours.
Thank you, Madeline. And thank you to everyone who is here and attending. I'm just in Zoom. I'm not in the loud swarm, so I can't tell if there's anybody here except for Madeline. So hopefully there's someone here, and they are. And this will be an interesting session for you. Before we start, I do want to make sure to give a thanks to the organizers and the volunteers. If you get a chance in Slack or wherever to thank the organizers or the volunteers, please do so. It's super awesome as attendees or even speakers at events like this. We just sort of show up and enjoy all the good stuff that goes on. And there's a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that all of this actually works and everything. So a big giant thank you to all of the organizers and volunteers. A little bit about me to get started. My name is John Turner. There's my email address if you want to get in contact with me afterwards. I guess technically you could email me during the session. I probably won't respond though. If you're one of those people who likes LinkedIn, you feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I work at a company called Immersion, which is not a typo. We do online language proficiency, online automated language proficiency assessments. So like you want to hire somebody, but they need to speak French well enough, you can send them to our site and have them take a test that tells how well they speak French or whatever. So that's cool. I write code there. I guess I should also say Immersion is also a sponsor for the conference. It doesn't have anything to do with me speaking. Like I was a speaker before Immersion was a sponsor. So hopefully there's not a conflict of interest there. If you do feel free to drop by the Immersion Slack channel in the Utah Geek Events Slack. If you want to talk to any of the engineers there, we have several who are in the Slack channel there. If you want to talk about mob programming or test-driven development or other cool stuff like that. We do also have a place where you can sign up if you'd like to try out mob programming. If you want to come and mob with us for a couple hours, we have a link in there to sign up for that. So that's my spiel about that. I also help organize a group called Utah Software Craftsmanship. That's the fourth link there. If you like talking about stuff like test-driven development or pair mob programming or continuous delivery, or really anything about the way in which we craft our software, I would invite you to come and hang out with us sometime. We meet on the first Wednesday of every month. We've been meeting virtually for the last 6 or 7 months. If you don't want to or can't attend the actual meetings and just want to come hang out on our Slack group, you're more than welcome to do that too. And the last link on there is a link to the slides, which I will also post in Slack. If you want to follow along and you're welcome to, or if you just want to copy for later, or if you want to skip ahead and get spoilers and have all my jokes get ruined, that's okay too. I will leave that up to you. I'll also have this link at the end for anyone who needs it. Or you can scan the QR code if you're one of those cool people with a cell phone. All right. So in the title of the presentation, it refers to lies. So let's talk for a minute about what is a lie. There are several different definitions for what a lie is. There's one definition that goes something along the lines of when you tell something that's untrue with the intent to deceive them. or with some other malicious intent. Now that's a great definition, and it's the one that I use with my kids, but it's a little bit different than the one we're going to use here. There's another definition of lie, of the word lie, that is simply something that's not true, something that is false. And that's the definition we're going to use here. The reason for that is because some of the things that I'm going to talk about and propose as being lies, I've heard from people who I don't think had bad intent. They maybe just had incorrect information. They didn't I don't want to attribute malicious intent to these things that I'm going to be proposing are lies. So that's the definition we're going to use. So why talk about lies at all? I like, as I was preparing for this presentation, I went online and looked for quotes about lies, and I found this one, which I liked. It says, "A lie told often enough becomes the truth," which sounds really cool. And when I first found it, I was like, "Oh, well, who said that?" And the first place I found said that Lenin said it. I was like, "Oh, that's cool. All right, Lenin. That's a good recognizable person." And then I was like, as I was preparing more, I was like, "Well, let me go just verify that. Since it is a presentation about lies, I should probably make sure that I don't say any lies." And so some other people said that no, it totally wasn't Lenin, it was somebody else. And other people said, no, the quote is just completely made up and it isn't really attributed to anyone. So yeah, take that for what you will. I do think, though, that regardless of who actually said the quote, that there is some truth in here. We as humans tend to give more credence. We believe a little bit more strongly in things that we hear a lot. So if we hear the same thing over and over again, even if it's not true, we tend to believe it more. So this presentation is first my attempt not to repeat some things that I believe are untrue, but also to refute them a little bit so that hopefully some other people, the attendees, in particular here, won't believe in them quite as much, hopefully. That's the thought. Okay, so what is this presentation about? What's it about? What's going to be like? I'd like this presentation to be sort of like this, this experienced voice of wisdom offering advice about a better path for those who come after. That's what I'd like it to be. It's entirely possible it'll end up being me just ranting about stuff that makes me grumpy for 40 minutes. That's entirely possible. I'm hoping, though, that regardless of which of those two ways, or maybe somewhere in the middle, that you perceive my presentation of all this information, I'm hoping that there will be at least some points along the way that give you something to think about. Think about when other people make claims that they're trying to convince you of, or when you yourself make claims about things when you're trying to convince someone. All right, so in this presentation, in the title, as we already mentioned, to talk about lies, we're going to talk about some lies. Now, sarcasm is hard at the best of times. And when you add in different cultures and remote technology and stuff like that, it can become even more challenging. So I'm going to be very explicit in this presentation. We're going to talk about some stuff that I believe to be not true. And so I want to make it very clear when we're talking about stuff that I am putting forth as being not true, that it is clear that it's not true. So when I put up a slide that contains information that I consider to be a lie, there will be the word lie up here in the upper right-hand corner. For example, this slide says all information in this presentation is perfect and should be followed without question. That is incorrect. That is something that is not true. So therefore, the word lie in the upper right-hand corner. We'll also talk about some things that I consider to be true. For those, we'll have the word truth in the upper right-hand corner. For example, this slide says this presentation contains guidelines and you should use your own judgment when following them. I consider that to be true. So because we're truth up there. Since this is a programming audience, maybe I should have put like true and false or something like that. I went with truth and lie instead. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the juicy lies. The first lie I want to start with is that a monolith is the worst software architecture. We all know that this is true, right? That a monolith is just the worst possible thing you can do. We're all familiar with the idea of a monolith. It's that big giant single code repo where people just dump everything and you can never find anything, and it's giant and it's horrible and everyone hates it and it makes you mad and want to hit things, and it just a monolith just makes you feel like this, right? It makes you feel like this inside. We all know that whoever made the choice to have a monolith architecture, that they were wrong and that they're probably a bad person. We also know that if you have a monolith, the very first thing you should do is just go ahead and take that 2 to 3 years to rewrite everything, right? To some sort of better architecture. We just know that all these things are right? Well, not necessarily. That's because our first truth, context is important. Are there any contexts in which a monolithic architecture could be the right choice? Sure there are. If you're on a smaller team, or you're just barely starting a new project, or you're in a code base that isn't likely to change a lot for the next couple of years or something like that. Those might be contexts in which a monolithic architecture would be a great choice. But it does depend on your context. And also, it's good to remember that contexts can change over time. So just because something was the right choice in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it will be the right choice in the future. But it all depends on context. So if a monolithic architecture isn't necessarily the worst possible technical decision that you could ever make, why would anyone make anything more complicated? Why would anyone have a more complicated architecture ever, if you could get away with a simpler one? That brings us to our next lie, which is because when you make something complicated, it shows how smart you are. For example, if I have to clone 42 different code repos and spin up 87 microservices and basically launch an entire miniature cloud infrastructure on my laptop in order to get a hello world, that just shows how smart I am. It shows off my mind powers, right? Mind power shows how smart I am. To refute this particular lie, I'd like to share a couple quotes. Now, I was talking about architecture. This particular quote talks about code, but I think it's the same ideas apply to architecture or code or tool chains or processes or other things as well. So this quote says, debugging is twice as hard as writing the code in the first place. Therefore, if you write the code as cleverly as possible, you are, by definition, not smart enough to debug it. If you make the most complicated possible code or tool chain or architecture or process as you can come up with, later when you have to go back and maintain it or understand it or change it in any way, it can become a lot more challenging. It can become challenging to make any modifications or change it or even understand it later. I also like this quote. This one comes from the Agile Manifesto. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. If you had two solutions to a given problem and they're identical in terms of like functionality and performance and other things like that, except one is simpler and one is more complicated, why would you ever pick the more complicated one, right? Sometimes in order to solve a problem, you do have to have a complicated solution because of the inherent complexity in the problem that you're solving. And in which case, definitely make your solution as complicated as necessary to solve the problem, but don't make it more complicated. This particular quote here, I actually like it enough that I'll go ahead and label this one as a truth. Do remember that code is a liability. You should have enough of it to solve your problem and generate value, but not more. I mentioned that this quote comes from the Agile Manifesto. Speaking of the Agile Manifesto, let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. That one is, if you implement insert software development methodology here, all your problems will go away. Now, I phrased this one fairly generically here. The way I usually hear it phrased is something like this: if you implement Scrum, all your problems will go away. Now, here when I refer to Scrum, I'm talking about like if you have an Agile consultant or an Agile coach or something come give you a 2-hour or half-day training on Scrum, and they talk about backlogs and sprint planning and sprint review meetings and daily stand-up, those standard rituals for Scrum. I'm talking about that and nothing more customized than that. A lot of people make a lot of claims about various software development methodologies, but they make them they tend, from my experience at least anyway, they tend to make them of Scrum the most. There's actually a book that in its title makes a fairly strong implication that if you just implement Scrum, then you will be able to do twice the amount of work in half the time. Now, to be fair, I haven't actually read this book, but I went to a 75-minute presentation on the book given by one of the authors, which I had to leave 40 minutes through because I couldn't stand it anymore. But the premise of the presentation, and maybe the book is better, but the premise of the presentation about the book was that all you have to do is implement Scrum and you will be as successful as Amazon, because the only choice that Amazon made that made them successful was implementing Scrum. It didn't have anything to do with the architectural decisions that they made, didn't have anything to do with any organizational structure choices that they made, or any other financial or business decisions. Those weren't important. It's just that they adopted Scrum, which is obviously ridiculous, right? So let's talk about the truthy corollary to that, and that is that Agile and lean software development methodologies can give you incredible and amazing tools to incrementally improve how you develop software. But you're probably not ever going to find a software development methodology that, if you implement it today, will completely revolutionize how you do your software development tomorrow. And even more unlikely that you will find one that will eliminate all of your problems. If you're just starting out with Agile or something like that, Scrum is a great place to start. But it's probably not where you should end. And it probably won't solve all of your problems. It will probably help you see where some of your problems are, but probably won't solve them. In my experience, with talking with other software developers, a lot of people are familiar with Agile software development, particularly Scrum. Fewer people, in my experience, are familiar with lean software development. I consider lean software development and Agile software development, they're sort of like cousins. There's a lot of overlap, but they do have some different focuses. Where I work, Immersion, we try to incorporate a lot of lean software development principles in the way that we work. Things like work in process limits, optimizing for flow efficiency, meaning getting stuff done, over resource efficiency, meaning having people be busy, reducing waste, stuff like that. If you're not familiar with lean software development and you want to learn more about it, these are a couple of books that you might want to look at. We're actually There are others as well. These aren't the only ones, but these are some. This is lean one. That one where immersion is actually doing a raffle, and you can get a copy of that one. It's a great one. There are a lot of good resources for agile software development methodologies as well. It's a little bit harder to find those online and differentiate between the ones that are good versus the ones that are trying to convince you that it will solve all your problems. So running down, I recommend people just go to straight to the Agile Manifesto. In particular, if you haven't ever, so the Agile Manifesto has 4 values, but then there are also 12 principles that build on those values. If you haven't read the principles before, I would highly recommend you go and check those out too. A lot of modern software development ideas come from those principles, like deliver frequently and work together as a cross-functional team and stuff like that. All right, let's move on to our next slide. That is that TDD is the same thing as writing unit tests. If I'm writing unit tests, then I'm doing TDD. And it's hard. No, that's wrong. Test-driven development, which is what TDD stands for, is a way to develop software. It is a way to design your software. It is a way to write software that is simpler and more maintainable. The fact that it happens to use testing is kind of ancillary. There are some people who would argue that if you did test-driven development to write your code and then threw away your tests at the end, that it would still be worth it. And I don't necessarily disagree with those people. The fact that you do end up with tested code at the end is nice, but for me at least, it's not the primary reason to do test-driven development. And to talk about the difficulty part, the first time you do TDD or unit testing, which again are not the same thing, but are related, it probably will be hard the first time you do it. The first 20 times you do it, it might be hard. When you do it the 100th time, maybe it'll be a little easier. If you do it the 1000th time, it'll probably be easier. And that's because test-driven development and writing unit tests, they're a skill. And like any other skill, you can improve them with practice. First time you do it, it probably will be hard. Along the lines of improving with practice, there's this book, it's called Mindset by Carol Dweck. She goes over, in this book, she talks about 2 general categories of mindset that people tend to have. One she calls a fixed mindset. And people who tend to have more of a fixed mindset tend to view themselves as having a certain amount of ability in a given area. And they're basically born with that amount of ability. And if they have a bunch of ability in a certain area, they're good at it. If they don't, they're not. And it's really you get what you're born with. The other mindset that she talks about, she calls a growth mindset, where people view themselves as having a certain amount of ability in a certain area, but that amount of ability can change over time. So if I practice a lot at something or I work really hard at something, I can improve my or increase the ability that I have in a certain area. And in this book, she talks about how having those 2 different mindsets can impact all kinds of areas in people's lives. Like here, just on the cover, it talks about parenting and relationships and other psychology and stuff like that. So it's really, really interesting. I personally really like the idea of being able to practice and improve in various aspects of our life. If you don't have access to this book or don't want to read the whole thing, I would recommend, or even if you do have access to the book, I guess, I would recommend watching this presentation by Linda Rising. She gives a presentation called she calls it the agile mindset, where she talks about these two different mindsets. Linda Rising is super awesome. If you're not familiar with her, imagine your kindly old grandma who bakes you cookies and also has a PhD in computer science and gives keynote presentations in front of audiences of thousands of people. Linda Rising, super awesome. If you ever get a chance to see her present, I would encourage you to just take advantage of that. If you want to learn more about test-driven development, there are a lot of good resources about test-driven development. A lot of books, videos, other tutorials and things online. This is sort of the seminal work on test-driven development. It's by Kent Beck. He's one of the Agile Manifesto signers, one of the originators of test-driven development. This is a great resource if you want to learn more about test-driven development, but there are other ones as well. So I would encourage you to go learn more about test-driven development, practice it if you haven't, get a little bit more familiar with it if you haven't tried it before. And the title of the presentation, I used a lie. Microservices will save your life. So we should probably talk about that particular lie at some point in the presentation. Otherwise, that'd be a little bit of false advertising, wouldn't it? So I've heard this particular lie a few times. I haven't usually heard it framed quite this strongly or quite this, oh, hey, look, Slack notifications on, or quite this straw man-y. I usually hear it phrased a little bit more like this, that a microservices architecture is the best architecture. So it's not quite as strong, but it's still pretty strong lie. So I went and did some research, and it turns out that actually microservices is not the only possible way to develop software. This probably comes as a shock to most of you, but you can actually develop software other ways. I went and did some research on the term microservices to try and figure out when it was coined. From what I could gather, it was coined at a conference in Venice or something in 2011. Now, not a lot of people know this, but the human race has actually developed software before 2011 when the term microservices was coined. Not a lot of people know that. If you want to feel old, this makes me feel old, at least anyway. The original iPhone was launched in 2007. So a good 4 years before the term microservices was coined. So if we could launch, if the human race could launch the iPhone without microservices, or at least without the term microservices, maybe we could write some other software without microservices as well. Now, the way that I usually hear this lie presented by people is something that goes along the lines like this. If you want to be a good person, then you have to do continuous delivery. Like we all know that, right? If you want to do continuous delivery, the only possible way to do continuous delivery is with microservices. And if you want to do microservices, the only possible way you do microservices is with containers, usually Docker. And if you want to do containers, the only possible way you can do containers is with Kubernetes. Or maybe you could use some other orchestration technique, but or tool, but it definitely has to be containers. You definitely have to have some orchestration tool in place there. And yeah, that's not to say that there's anything bad about any of these technologies. They're all great technologies or architectures. Or processes. They're all great. But they're not all the same thing, and you don't. There's not this false equivalency. I've been to some presentations where people present this as essentially like the one true way to write software. Well, we figured it out as humans. We sort of stumbled along for 50 or 60 years in the computer science field, but now we figured it out, right? We've solved software development. Congratulations to us. We did it. We did it. I would find this particular argument even a little more compelling if it weren't for this next lie, which is the software development industry has a consistent definition of a microservices architecture. We have people advocating that we should develop our software a certain way when we don't even have a consistent definition of what that way is. Okay, I'm gonna calm down. You can tell I can get a little passionate about this. If you read this book on the left, called Building Microservices, it's by Sam Newman. He literally wrote the book on microservices. He was one of the people in the original group talking about and coining the term microservices. He actually uses a definition of microservices that is quite different than what some people define as a microservice. He uses a definition of that's a lot bigger than some people. Some people want their microservices to be super, super tiny, and he advocates for a larger definition, a definition that includes larger pieces of functionality for microservices. So I would recommend that book. He also has another book called Monolith to Microservices, which I would recommend, especially if you do have a monolithic architecture that you want to migrate to a microservices one. It's interesting that he spends the first third, maybe half of the book, trying to convince you shouldn't move from a monolithic architecture to a microservices architecture. Convince is kind of a strong word. He does spend that first a good first chunk of the book talking about some of the challenges that get introduced with microservices architecture, some of the trade-offs, and then he goes through a bunch of like techniques and patterns and stuff for migration. So if you're in that situation, I highly recommend that book. So it turns out that microservices isn't the only way to do continuous delivery. It can be a great way to do continuous delivery, but it's not necessarily the only way. That is because context is important. Yep, that's it. This is still true. You may remember this from a previous slide. It's still true. So with this talking about like monolith and microservice architectures, I'm not trying to argue that one is good and one is bad. What I am trying to argue for, though, is to use a solution that is correct or appropriate for your context. And that brings us to the last lie that we're going to talk about, and that is that there is a silver bullet. If you're not familiar with the term silver bullet as it is applied to software development, it comes from this book, The Mythical Man Month. It actually comes from, so the Mythical Man Month is by Fred Brooks. It's sort of a collection of essays. And so the no silver bullet idea came from an essay that he posted. And then when he compiled them into a book, it's one of the chapters in the book. So I would totally recommend reading this book if you haven't before. But if you don't want to read the whole thing or don't have access to it or whatever, there's a link here down at the bottom for just the essay. I'd recommend going and reading that. So in that chapter / essay, Fred Brooks, he talks about the story of the werewolf. If you're not familiar with a werewolf, it's a person who's normally a person, but sometimes, usually at the full moon, they turn into this giant, terrifying wolf monster thing and go around killing livestock and people and generally terrorizing the countryside. And one of the scariest things about a werewolf is that you can fight it with weapons and stuff, and you can maybe hurt it and you can drive it off for a while, but it'll always come back because you can't kill it with normal weapons. You can only kill it if you shoot it with a bullet that is made out of silver. And so Fred Brooks draws an analogy between this werewolf story and software development, where a lot of times in software development, we want this silver bullet. We want, and I wouldn't even necessarily use the word easy, but straightforward solution to the problem of software development. We want to say, well, if I just switch to this programming language, then all the problems that I had in my previous projects, those will all be solved because this new programming language will solve them, or this new framework, or this new software development methodology or process, or this, if I just have this new tool, if I could just track my bugs better, just had a better bug tracking system, then all my problems would go away. To that idea, Fred Brooks says this. He said, there is no single development in either technology, so I mean like programming languages or frameworks or stuff like that, or management technique, so processes, software development methodologies, things like that, which by itself promises even one order of magnitude improvement in productivity. Now you'll notice here he's not saying that you can't switch to a new technology or management technique and get an improvement. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying that if you switch to a new technology or a new management technique, you're probably not going to get an order of magnitude, like a really big improvement in your productivity. It'll probably be incremental. You can totally switch to, that new programming language or use that new framework, and it might be better, but it's probably not going to be hugely better. And that's because it's rare that a technique or technology or process is universally better, right? Or is always better. And the thing, the place where we run into trouble is that always word. Always is very absolute, right? And as we all know, only Sith deal in absolutes. And it's hilarious that a Jedi said that in the movie, but that's a discussion for another time. Most of these kinds of decisions where you're like, should we use programming language X or Y, or should we use this framework or that framework, or this architecture or that architecture, this process or this or some other process? Most of those kinds of decisions usually involve some kind of trade-off. There's sometimes when you make those when you have that kind of decision where you really do just have positives and there are no negatives. It's not super common, but it can happen. In which case, it's kind of a no-brainer. Well, yeah, sure. If there are only benefits in this choice and none in this choice, obviously go with this one. But what's more common is that there will be a trade-off. You will get some good things, but some bad things. And again, in some situations, the good things far outweigh the bad things, in which case it's a pretty easy choice. But sometimes, I would even say more commonly, sometimes the bad things aren't so great, and you have to think about it for a while. Even in the situations where it's pretty clear that the pros outweigh the cons, it's still worth thinking about the cons. Sometimes you'll find you'll think about you haven't thought about the cons, and you'll stop and think about them and be like, oh yeah, this would be totally great, except for this one little thing. Oh yeah, oh no, we don't want to do that. The con will be a lot bigger, or one of the cons will be a lot bigger than you originally thought. At the very least, you'll be making a more informed decision, right? You decide to adopt this new framework, and going into it that there will be some drawbacks. So 6 months down the road or whatever, when you start feeling some of those negative effects, you'll be like, okay, well, this is bad. We knew this was going to happen, and maybe here's how we've decided to address that challenge. Or yeah, we knew this part was gonna suck, but we got all these other benefits instead, and at the time we thought it was worth it. You could ask yourself if it still is worth it. Hopefully it is, but you can at least ask that question. So hopefully we can, when we're faced with those sort of decisions, we can look at them critically and think about both the positives that are highly publicized as well as the negatives that maybe aren't so highly publicized. And we do that critical thinking rather than just always chasing the new shiny thing that promises to solve all of our problems. And of course, that is because there is no silver bullet. Again, this isn't to say that we shouldn't learn new languages or new frameworks or try to seek out improvements, but we should look at those decisions critically, look at both the pros and the cons, and we probably shouldn't expect any one of those decisions to have a huge, monumental impact on the way that we develop software. Not to say that that can't happen, but it doesn't happen very often. All right, so we've talked about some lies and some truths. Let's chat about it for just a little bit longer. So why is it that these lies, and by no means is this a comprehensive list of all possible lies or truths that I or anyone else has encountered in software development, but why do these lies and things like them tend to propagate? Why don't, if we were all just rational human beings, someone would say one of these lies and someone else would say, no, that's not right because, and give a list, a nice concise list of here's why those things aren't correct. And then everyone would be like, oh yeah, that's obviously not right. Let's stop talking about that lie. But that doesn't happen. We still have people trying to convince us of things that may or may not be true, right? So let's talk for a minute about why it is that people try to convince us of these lies or of other things. So one possible reason why somebody might try to convince you of something is because they simply have a different opinion than you do. There's some things that come down to just a matter of opinion. It's not necessarily better or worse. It's just different. And I have one opinion, you have a different opinion. And as long as we can discuss those differences respectfully, but it's fine. It's really fine to have different opinions. You can like programming language X, I can like programming language Y. They're probably both Turing complete, and it's fine. Now, it may be in situations like this that someone feels like you maybe don't understand all of the benefits that their opinion has, and maybe they're trying to convince you of that. And again, as long as they're being respectful, then that's fine. And in this sort of situation, when people are trying to convince you of something, then it's usually relatively harmless. Again, as long as we're being respectful and realize that we're talking about opinions rather than straight up, facts or things like that. So this one's usually relatively harmless as long as it's kept within check. Another possible reason why someone might try to convince you of something is maybe they don't actually understand the whole problem space yet. Maybe they went and read a blog post about this cool new framework, and so then they come to work and try to convince everyone they should use it, but they haven't fully researched it and don't know about some of the cons that it might introduce into your system. That's entirely possible. In this situation, you kind of maybe need to be a little bit more careful because you'd like to help those people understand, get a better understanding of the context, but you don't want to squash them and be like, you're wrong and you're a terrible person for advocating for this. You don't want to do that. You also want to make sure that it's not you that doesn't understand, right? That someone's advocating some new thing that really is better, but because you don't understand the full context, you're arguing that we shouldn't do whatever choice that person is presenting. So have to be a little bit more careful here. This next reason, so I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to assume that there are no aliens or robots or supernatural powers attending this presentation. If there are any of those groups or other such groups, listening, please feel free to make your presence known in Slack channel or whatever. But I'm gonna assume that we're all human, and I'm also gonna assume that being human, we all have human brains. And human brains are super awesome and can do amazing and wonderful things. But sometimes the way they do those things introduces some, they take, you could call them shortcuts, in order to be able to do some of the amazing things that they do. And sometimes those shortcuts introduce some drawbacks, things like cognitive biases. For example, one of the things that our human brains do is as we're going through our lives, we have an internal narrative, a story. Our brains tell ourselves a story as we're going throughout our lives, and we're a character in that story. Not only are we a character, we're the main character, and we're the hero. So as I'm going through my life, my brain is telling me a story where I am the hero. As you're going through your life, your brain is telling you a story where you're the hero. And in that story, and so our brain will look for things that corroborates the fact or adds credence to the idea that we're the hero of the story. So sometimes this is a great thing. For example, if somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, you can't write code that does this because you're no good," or whatever, or it's impossible. My brain could say, "Oh, well, that's not true because you think you can do it, and you're the hero of the story. Therefore, you can do anything." And so I'll assert myself and work really hard, and I'll write the code that does that thing that somebody said I couldn't do, and I'll overcome those sorts of obstacles. In that case, it's a good thing. But it can sometimes be a bad thing, where like if you like programming language X and I like programming language Y, my brain will tell me a story of, well, you like programming language Y and you're the hero of the story. Therefore, anyone who makes a different choice is wrong because you made the right choice because you're the hero of the story. In that case, it gets a bit more dangerous. And that can be one reason why someone is trying to convince you of something, because they've made a choice and they want to feel justified in that choice. They want other people to make the same choice so that internal story in their head has more supporting evidence that they are the hero of their story because they made the right choice, because they picked the right programming language, or they picked the right framework or the right architecture, and other people agree with them. And that just shows that they're the hero of their story. Again, that's not necessarily a bad or malicious thing, depending on how people do it. But it can be one of the reasons why someone is trying to convince you of something, because they want you to agree with them so that internal story in their head where they're the hero has more supporting evidence. So this one's a little bit more potentially dangerous. Got to be a little more careful here. The next one that is even more dangerous. Sometimes people try to convince you of something because they get some benefit if they can convince you. Sometimes this one can be fairly innocuous. It's more innocuous. Like if for some reason, if we're at work together and I'm trying to convince you that we should use this framework because then I can tell my boss that I had influence on other people in the company and I get a better annual review or something like that, maybe that's okay. Where I personally get really skeptical is when money is directly involved. Like when someone is trying to convince me that their tool or programming language or process or whatever, especially when they make grandiose claims that whatever they're trying to convince me of will solve all of my problems, and there won't be any downsides, and that I can only get it by giving them lots of money. That's where I get really skeptical, and where this particular one can get fairly dangerous. And the last reason I want to talk about why someone may try to convince you is maybe, just maybe, someone is trying to convince you of something because they actually want to help you. Maybe, just maybe, someone is trying to convince you of something because to help you avoid some of the mistakes that they have made in the past. And maybe someone is trying to convince you of something because they want to help you avoid some of the pain that they have felt in the past. And hopefully that's what this presentation has been. Thank you everyone who has attended. Again, if you would like to contact me, there's my email, my LinkedIn profile. If you want to corroborate with me about these lies and truths, feel free to contact me. If you're like, no, John, you're totally wrong. This thing that you presented as a lie, it's totally truth, or vice versa. You can please feel free to email me and tell me why I'm wrong. Again, there's the link down here if you'd like a copy of the slides, or you can scan the QR code. Also, please give feedback to your presenters. If you have feedback for me, I would love to hear it. If you're just like, it was fine, and you don't really have feedback for me, if you have feedback for other presenters, I'm sure that they appreciate it. Please give feedback to them. And with that, again, thank you for your attendance. And we will now go to questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, John. We don't have any questions just yet. A couple of comments. William noted that an order of magnitude is way more improvement than anyone could reasonably expect. And also provided this example that the Netflix contest to improve the algorithm to predict people's preferences in movies produced an unexpectedly great improvement, and it amounted to 8%. So.
Yeah. Thank you to those who shared their comments. Those are great.
Okay, while we wait for any final questions to come into that Slido chat on the right-hand side of your screen, John, we do also have a Slack room for room 1. So if you wouldn't mind until maybe about 3:15, staying in there in case people do have some questions they're typing in there. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything else. So, oh, just kidding. We've got a couple questions here. What's the scariest programming lie you've ever heard, from Michael Warren?
Oh, what is the scariest programming lie you've heard? There's so many to choose from. I mean, probably just in general, it is probably the silver bullet one, just because that can be applied to a lot of things. You know, the idea of we just need to switch to this thing, whatever that thing is, and all of our problems will go away. That's the one that scares me the most, because you have someone who's passionate about something, but who obviously doesn't understand all of the context. Yeah, so I'd go with that one. There are probably others though. I would love to hear what other people's scariest programming lies that they've heard. If you want to share those in the Slack channel, I would love to hear those.
We've got a couple already. So yeah, if anybody's got some additional ones, go ahead and pop them in that Slack channel. I think that brings us to the end of your presentation though. So thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thank you, Madeline, for moderating. Thank you again, everyone who attended.
All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you in the Slack room for the next 5 minutes or so. And then we've got one more track at 3:30 for you to choose from. So we'll see you there.